now. It's the Finding Your Spine podcast with host Chase Spears.
Differentiating between physical courage and moral courage is important in the Army context, especially because culturally the Army expects physical courage and it rewards physical courage. And I don't think that that's a problem that we have in the Army. I think most people in the Army are physically courageous, and you can count on people within the Army to demonstrate that physical courage. The issue is moral courage. And moral courage, I mean, by its own definition, is hard because it's those circumstances where your impression of doing the right thing doesn't align with what the organization expects.
Welcome back to Finding Your Spine, a podcast where we call morally principled men and women to step out of the shadows and challenge them to put the truth to work in their lives, leadership, and workplaces. I'm Chase Spears, and I'm here with my friend Dr. Grant Smith today for a really engaging conversation about the philosophy of courage. And this is a man who is deeply steeped in that. One of the things I've learned in life is anytime you're going to grow, you need to find people who are way smarter than you, and you need to find rooms where you're probably going to be the dummy in it. And fortunately for me, I have that whenever I step into a room with Grant Smith. He is a man who is just absolutely brilliant. Every conversation that we have, he challenges me to think in ways I haven't thought before, and I always grow and learn. I know I will from this discussion, and I hope all of you will as well. For a little bit of introductory information, Grant has been in the Army for 15 years. He started off as an infantryman and is now actually a doctor of physical therapy. He used to lead soldiers in combat, and now he helps put them back together. He's currently a student at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, where he lives with his wife and now 3 daughters. You just had another one, right?
Indeed.
That's wonderful. And you can also find his writings. He's prolific on X at Liberty Superman, and he's also quite active on Substack. He does writings on holistic health and fitness at H2F Man, and he covers topics including American identity and socio-political issues at radicalamerican.substack.com. So, Grant, it's really great to have you here today. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks so much for having me. I got to correct you on one thing. Not only have I not led soldiers in combat, I haven't even gone on a combat deployment. So just to clear that up, not trying to do any stolen valor here. I'm flattered that you had that impression of me, but no combat deployments. Never led soldiers in combat.
Well,
although I was an infantry platoon leader at one point.
Well, I would follow you
in garrison.
I would follow you, and anyone else would be wise to do the same thing if the need ever arose. All right.
Thank you, Chase.
Hopefully that would be my only fiction today. So, tell you what, before we go deep, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Dr. Grant Smith?
So I think you did a good overview of my background in terms of education. I would say, this is, religiously affiliated organization. Thanks so much for having me to that. My background in terms of religion is I was raised as Unitarian Universalist. So, if you're familiar with Unitarian Universalists, you might cringe at that mention. But they're technically Christian, which I didn't even realize until, the last couple of years. And they've since gone down the progressive rabbit hole. And we might get into that. But I've always been very interested in philosophy and religion. And that's one of the things that I did enjoy about growing up, going to UU Church Sunday School, is the ability to talk about things, question things, and I feel like I've applied that in everything I've done. And not everybody thinks philosophy is super important, but it's what I like to think about. And the reason that I went from being an infantryman to a physical therapist, and why I became an infantryman in the first place, is I'm trying to be useful. And in the world today, it's very difficult. If you have both eyes open, you're looking at, the economy and just, the monetary system with everything kind of being fake. It's hard to find something where you can be useful and do meaningful work. And I finally landed on something in physical therapy that I think does that, where I'm able to help people recover from injuries, perform better, in a very straightforward way. But if I wasn't in the military and had to go, pay for school, it'd be $150,000, something like that, to go through PT school. Then you have debt, and then PTs outside of the Army. I get paid more in the Army as a physical therapist than I would as a civilian, like a lot more. And so those things allow me to do something meaningful and get paid to do it. And so I'm, grateful to be in the Army, able to serve, able to take care of soldiers. And that's kind of what drives me, is to do something meaningful, first of all, and then, fulfill my obligations based on whatever roles I have. And so as a physical therapist and an Army officer right now, that's taking care of soldiers, and that unfortunately has expanded into talking a lot about philosophical and political stuff since, the COVID mandate.
Well, and I, for one, am really grateful for the work that you do. You've never worked on me physically, but I've had we were talking on the drive over about the multiple issues that I've had with injuries coming out of my training, injuries in combat. And I very much appreciated the physicians, and I spent a lot of time with physical therapists who helped put me back together and help rebuild things, as we were talking about, literally rebuilding my shoulder. So definitely really grateful for the work you do. You played an important role on the team. And so I also want to bring up, I appreciate you bringing up our differences in religious perspective. I actually didn't know you were raised Unitarian Universalist. I knew we differed in where I'm Christian and you do not hold to that same tradition, but we find a lot of common ground philosophically, and I think it's really, that's why I'm even more excited about this discussion today, to find out how people who may not agree with me in terms of my theological commitments, how we still work together to try to get people to step out, who share our basic moral convictions, to step out of the shadows and do the right thing and to not be in hiding. And that gets to the whole topic of courage, which we're going to be talking about. And I want to start off by just throwing out there on the table a basic idea of what I think of when I think of courage, what I think it means. And I tend to think of it meaning as you have this morally righteous end state that you have to get to. And in order to get to it, it means you may have to put yourself in some form of physical danger, maybe fiscal danger, maybe danger of being disliked, maybe danger of being mocked, ridiculed. But that end state that you have to get to is bigger than you, and it's right. And in order to go there, you're going to have to take risk. But the righteousness of that end state is greater to you than the risk you'd have to put yourself in. And so courage, obviously not being the absence of fear, but the willingness to push through it. And at its most base level, that's kind of the Chase Webster's dictionary term of what I think of when I think of courage. You have a lot more to say about the deeper philosophy of courage. So let's start there.
So I think differentiating between physical courage and moral courage is important in the Army context, especially because culturally the Army expects physical courage and it rewards physical courage. And I don't think that that's a problem that we have in the Army. I think most people in the Army are physically courageous, and you can count on people within the Army to demonstrate that physical courage. The issue is moral courage. And moral courage, by its own definition, is hard because it's those circumstances where your impression of doing the right thing doesn't align with what the organization expects. And that's why it takes moral courage. So if you have a conviction or your conscience is telling you that, hey, this is the right thing to do, and that doesn't align with what the institution and what the common assumptions is of the people around you, then you are going to be punished for exhibiting that behavior. And that's why it takes courage, because you know that you're going to be punished. So, the physical courage is, hey, I'm facing down physical danger. That's expected. But people understand that, but what they don't understand is the role that status plays and how status is a much more powerful motivator than your physical safety. Because your status, in an evolutionary context, like just psychologically, that's what drives us. Because our success, our ability to get resources, provide for our families, and ensure all of the things that we want happen down the road is dependent upon our status. It equates to power. We're social animals. And so our individual strength, like how much you can deadlift, is not nearly as important to your success as an individual. Your community, your family, that's not going to be determined by your max deadlift. It's going to be determined by your status. And exhibiting moral courage is when, hey, there's this right thing to do, and I'm going to take a hit to my status in order to do that. So that's what I really focus on when thinking about courage in the Army context, because so often it gets, that physical dimension gets focused on. And I think the COVID vaccine mandate really showed that discrepancy, because people had worked with people through the global war on terror and knew there were plenty of people with tons of physical courage that just completely folded, knowing that, hey, this experimental treatment is not appropriate to mandate on young, healthy service members. Even if people didn't have the medical background to know that, most people knew it intuitively, and they weren't able to act on those convictions and resist the mandate because they weren't able to tolerate challenge to their status in the same way that they were able to tolerate risk to their physical well-being in combat or in other circumstances.
And I think this goes so wide. That's why I love this topic. You and I experienced it in the Army, and we've even talked about some officers we saw who, what was the difference in their level of conscience and their level of adherence to the status as a differentiator between, whether they took the shot and pushed on others or whether they didn't, and a whole other litany of moral things that they did or didn't do. Why is status so important to us? Why is that the crux? It seems that so much of our life decisions are built around, because I saw it when I was in the academy, finishing my doctorate. I actually had one of the professors out there. I won't go into any detail on it because this person would not want me to, but reached out to me and said, "Hey, I am so glad to see you as a doctoral student taking the stand you take, saying the things you're saying." And to me, I'm not doing any activism. I'm just saying things like the curtain is blue, the sky is blue, hot is hot, cold is cold. I'm not doing anything I think is really great, is really newsworthy. I'm just saying things as I see them, acknowledging ontology. And this professor reached out to me and said, I can't say these things because I would be punished. And this is a land-grant institution in the geographic center of the United States. We're not talking about Columbia. We're not talking about Georgetown. And I've seen it in so many other places. Why are we so hung up on status as to the point that we will let it override what we know to be right?
Because it determines our success, more than anything. It's people's perception of you. It's people's perception of your character. And that perception, while it isn't reality, and this is a big confusing point, that perception can be reality. Perception is not reality. Perception is the perception of reality. When those two things diverge, you can be put into a position where all the incentives align to cultivate and manage that perception, because that perception is going to determine your success. So I read a good book that was recommended by my friend Alex Macris recently called The Formula, and it actually came up in one of the strategy classes that I'm taking right now at CGSOC. And it's that your success is it basically comes up with principles of what determines success. So where performance is easy to measure, success is determined by performance. But how much of our everyday lives and all of the professions that people have, the jobs that people have, how easy is it to measure performance? Say in art, say in medicine, in science, where we have a replication crisis. It's very difficult to measure performance. So like in science, they measure performance by publications. Well, does it have to be a quality paper that reveals something interesting, or does it just have to be published and cited by other people? when you're a medical provider and you're seeing patients, are you rated by how many of your patients get better and how fast? Or are you evaluated on how many patients you're seeing, period, objectively? Right now, in Defense Health Agency, it's predominantly the latter. How many patients you see is how good of a provider you are from the perspective of the system. So your performance isn't being evaluated. Nobody can really tell. So in those circumstances where you can't evaluate performance, what determines your success is networks. It's your relationships. That's it. It's your relationships with other people. So this colleague / mentor / contact of yours that was concerned about not being able to say things is very smart. Because if they said something, it would immediately disrupt those networks that they are intertwined within that are determinative of their success. And they would not be as successful. They would have a more difficult time professionally. But that gets to the point of what we're talking about and why you have to take a stand, because at a certain point, what is your status for? Mm-hmm. What is your success for? Successful at what? Making money? Or are you trying to actually do something with your life? And if you're trying to actually do something, then the perception of your character isn't nearly as important as your actual character. And your own evaluation of what your character is then becomes more important ultimately in the long run when you're measured against that objective standard of what you're actually doing. And I think this is something that people who aren't traditionally religious, especially atheists, struggle with, because they imagine that there's not an objective observer kind of at the end of space and time that is able to make such a judgment. But whether or not, there is one, we can conceive of that, and there is something real. You either did something or you didn't. And the perception not aligning with reality does not overtake the fact that reality is what it is.
You've got a quote going through my head right now. I think it's from Julius Caesar. William Shakespeare wrote, essentially, the coward dies 1,000 deaths, whereas the brave die only once. And it's a heavy paraphrase. But I think back to people who have told me, and you've probably encountered some of these same people, who said, yeah, but I'm staying in the machine because the longer I stay in, and the more rank that I get, and the more influence that I get, eventually I'll reach a point that I'm able to do something about it. And I've watched a lot of these people over the years, and I'm sitting there saying, okay, when is it you eventually get to do something about it? When do you actually get to help fix it? And my observation is most of them end up aging out and retiring out of the system without having moved it, but they swore all along, hey, I held this conviction, I just had to be quiet about it because eventually I was going to get to the place I could actually use my morality for good and help the organization. And increasingly, I think, no, you weren't. You were just trying to survive.
I think that that's an example of efficient self-deception. So, that's a lie that they're telling themselves because it never gets easier to do the right thing. You can always use that as an excuse that if I continue compromising my principles, if I continue focusing on cultivating a perception, then that'll allow me to network and it will allow me to be more powerful socially. You'll always be able to tell yourself that. So when's that point when you shift and you cash in some of that social capital in order to do the right thing? That time never comes because you habituate the idea along the way that you are doing things that are useful. And this is the big problem as I see it. So taken from there's a field called cybernetics, which is just a field dealing with complexity, looking at complex systems, and they can be organic systems. And there's a guy named Stafford Beer who's a cyberneticist that came up with the phrase, the purpose of a system is what it does. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the military and you look at what it does, this is what everybody is recognizing when they're looking at the failure of global war on terror, the failure of Vietnam. They're looking at this system and they're saying, hey, is it really providing us security? like the way the Constitution tells us to. And it's like, it's obviously not. It's not what it's doing. So how does the system work? What is it really doing? And you can apply that same rationale to humanity writ large, any complex system. You can say, what is it doing? And that can allow you to think of what the purpose is. But then also, cybernetics is about control mechanisms and feedback loops. And, looking at humanity writ large, I think that the best control mechanism that we have is conscience. And you can argue about how it got there. Like God put it there or nature. It doesn't matter. We know that it's there because we subjectively experience it. Mm-hmm. And that conscience, that's that coordinating mechanism that tells us how to cooperate. Because that's the big trick, right? How do we cooperate as human beings? Because cooperation, everybody wins. That's a win-win. The reason that it's challenging to get after cooperation is because people can always defect. They can lie, they can deceive, they can also use coercion. What's to keep people from doing that when it's convenient to do so? Well, the only mechanism that we really have is conscience. And that goes with something as simple as you feel bad for lying to somebody to something more complex like the way revenge works, where if somebody does defect and they do lie to you or they manipulate somebody, that makes you want to punish them. And in game scenarios where this is gamed out, environments where there's no revenge possible, where nobody can be held accountable for defecting, cooperation breaks down entirely. So we have this mechanism, this control mechanism for humanity that, I think you can say God put there, right? And if you don't listen to that mechanism, if you don't listen to that conscience, we're not going to be able to fulfill our purpose as human beings. We're ignoring our purpose. We're abandoning it. And that can be done a couple of different ways. Like the most obvious way is you have some material gain that you are persuaded like, oh, I'm going to get after this material gain. So like that individual that said, hey, I wish I could say what I want. Well, they're getting a material gain. They're getting status out of not speaking their mind.
It's a trade-off.
Yeah. And so they feel that. They feel moral injury from that. Their conscience is telling them that's the wrong thing to do. And so they look at what you're doing and they're saying, hey, great job, Chase. Like, that's awesome. I wish I could do that. I feel bad that I don't do that. Everybody kind of understands that. What people don't understand as much is the efficient self-deception. The fact that when you lie to yourself and you believe it, that makes you much more effective at deceiving others. So like that's research from Robert Trivers, wrote a book on that. The idea there is that, you're not going to have, your conscience isn't going to have a problem if you believe the lie. If you believe the lie and then you deceive somebody based on believing that lie, well, you're not doing anything wrong. Mm-hmm. You're just delusional, right? But that's just as evil as, choosing to do the wrong thing for wealth or status, right? It's the same. So we have this challenge, in life, and I think this big spiritual war that we're in, the challenge is, how do we listen to that conscience and how do we avoid deceiving ourselves when it's convenient? And if we can do those two things, then also third, punishing people that, are delusional and willfully deceive and use coercion. Those three things, if we can do those things, we can get back to cooperating. But until that happens, the whole foundation of, everything that's good in life and our purpose as human beings, we will not be able to achieve it. And so that's why you have to exhibit courage, is because that's an opportunity to do the right thing and get us onto the track of cooperation. Mm-hmm. Everybody that capitulates, they're a part of the problem. And my conscience won't allow me to be part of the problem. Like, I'm not going to be part of the problem. Maybe I don't have the solution, but I do know that, for example, capitulating to an ineffective and unsafe experimental product that's inappropriate for me to take, I know that that is wrong. I know that that's morally wrong. I know that's a violation of conscience. I know that forcing other people to do it is wrong. And so I can't capitulate, because then you're just rewarding you're getting rid of that control mechanism, and then we don't have a control mechanism, and then we lose our humanity. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm always trying to think through this stuff, and was just reintroduced to complexity theory in one of the strategy classes. So this is not like, I have these solid positions that is mapped out. It's very difficult to talk about and explain what I kind of see in my mind's eye when it comes to this stuff. And this isn't necessarily what went through my head as I was resisting the mandate. Like Rob Greene, his wife encouraged him. That happened with me too, where she was like, shot's going to come out. You're not getting it, because she could just sense that it was wrong. And so that forced me to dig deeper and look at it. But that's one of the reasons that I'm so blessed to have a wife like that, because she keeps me more in touch with conscience and makes it less likely for me to be able to delude myself and engage in self-deception.
It's like we want to have it all, right? And we see this a lot today with people saying, well, I can't have the full career, and I can have the full personal life, and I can have the full philanthropic, giving things away life. Words are escaping me at the moment. And it's a delusion, right? And so I was thinking as you were saying that we want to believe that we can have this objective morality, and we also want to believe that we can put that in a closet and hide it away because, well, it's for some grander good. If I hide my morality in a closet and I disassociate from it and I don't let people know what I believe, and I allow, as Solzhenitsyn said, the lie to come through me, that I'm still in some way doing good. And I think that really does require a lot of self-deception. I've thought back several times to the O.J. Simpson case. I'm convinced the man died believing he was innocent. I think if you tell yourself a lie enough times, you eventually will come to believe it. That's the power of narrative, and repetition. You just say it over and over and over and over again, and eventually you will delude yourself. And it just seems to me like that's what a lot of people are doing. They're deluding themselves into believing that what is wrong, i.e. compartmentalizing truth, is in some way right, so they can feel like, oh yeah, I am having both. I am having my truth, and I am having professional success.
Yeah, in order to convince, you, for instance, that they're a good person and that they're aligned with you, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're networking with you too, when they're telling you. So it's like it's efficient self-deception. Mm-hmm. They believe it. They're trying to convince you so that they can be networked. And I don't know exactly what the right answer for that is. Like, do you not interact with those people? Do you cut them out of your individual networks? I don't know. I tend to think that trying to communicate with everybody is beneficial, but I wouldn't trust someone like that. Mm-hmm. You can't, because they're lying to themselves. Like, you can't trust that. I think the COVID thing revealed that. A lot of people had leaders they thought that they could trust, or people that they worked with that they thought that they could trust. And when it came down to it, those people were not willing to suffer even the potential for a loss of status in order to stand up for that individual. So in a really granular way, I can give you the example of commanders were asked to give recommendations to approve or deny religious accommodation requests. Mm-hmm. And JAGs, so the military attorneys at various echelons, gave standard language that they wanted commanders to put into their recommendations to make it easier to facilitate denying those accommodation requests. And most commanders just put that language in. The ones that didn't, that have questions, and say, hey, this is supposed to be my assessment. Pressure was put on them. Like, hey, is this really the hill you want to die on? Mm-hmm. And, I can tell you that in my case, I considered my company commander a friend, somebody that I trusted at least a little bit. And he recommended, he used the standard language that was given to him without pushing back at all. And, I think he's going to be retiring without making any additional rank. So it didn't get him anything. And I know from other commanders that pushed back and said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give my own recommendation. They survived it. So there's also this perverse situation where people's perception of how it's going to impact their status is actually inflated. People can get away with standing their ground to a greater extent than they even think that they can. Mm-hmm. Depending on the individual, so like my career survived. I got lucky in some respects. In some ways I lost status. So in the eyes of people that don't believe that it's acceptable for a medical provider to question the safety and efficacy of any vaccine or a mandated vaccine, those people think that I'm an idiot and totally untrustworthy and incompetent. But people that have the same perspective as I do, have more status in their eyes. So we're kind of going through this, divergence that extends to touch all of American society and touches on what's American identity, what's our identity. Mm-hmm. And there's, a battle over that, because status, honor, reputation, that's all relative to identity. And so if we don't have a cohesive identity, there's not one standard that all of that is set by. So that creates problems with evaluating all this stuff too. And for national strategy, you can't have a national strategy without a coherent national identity, because the identity determines what the interests are. Mm-hmm. You don't have a national interest if you don't have national identity. So these problems go really deep, and if you're not concerned about doing the right thing, about listening to your conscience, about the possibility of self-deception, if you think all that's just silly philosophical stuff, then you're never going to be able to solve the problems that we face, because you have to at least try your best to see reality as it is, even if it's unflattering to your image or people's perception of you, if you want to find solutions to the problems that we face. And if you think that we don't face problems and everything's fine, I'd say you're clearly delusional, because we have large problems. Not only Americans as Americans and as a nation, but also globally, humanity, faces problems and challenges and threats. And we have different obligations based on those different identities. And if we aren't thinking of those identities, thinking about what those obligations are, and we're just never going to be able to overcome the challenges we face.
Well, I think something else is that a lot of people don't understand that, yes, there's risk to taking a stand and being true. But as you pointed out, there's also reward. Like the people who have potentially lost faith in you, they're probably people you really don't care about their opinion of you, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I'd like to not care about their opinion, but I'm very sensitive. Yeah. I want everybody to like me, So I don't like it. I don't like it when people don't like me or are angry with me or think I'm stupid, but there's a certain sense in which it's inevitable if their perspective is not aligned with reality.
Yeah.
Right? So if I see reality a certain way and they see it completely different, then, either one of us has to change or we're not going to have a high opinion of one another.
I mean, I remember when I first started walking through this, it was really kind of the 2018, 2019 period for me. And there were, like you, I want people to like me. Who doesn't want to be liked? But there were a lot of people whose opinions I really cared about. And as I got more active on the writing scene and started seeing some of them back away, at first it was a painful reaction, like, ouch, I don't like that. But with time and with practice, I came to find, a lot of these people were not as worth trying to pursue their approval as much as I thought they were. And by speaking truth, there were other people who actually connected to me because they said, hey, I actually want to be connected with someone who will speak out. Now, a lot of them do so in the shadows, admittedly. A handful of them do so openly. But I have grown increasingly comfortable with the fact that because I am willing to say what I know to be true, that there are going to be some circles I'm never going to run in, and that's just the way it is. But that also has opened up some doors for great relationships. I mean, the fact that you and I know each other is a fruit of that exact thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we wouldn't be in contact otherwise. We wouldn't have found each other.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think there's tremendous value in your friendships being real.
Mm-hmm.
And, I feel at a very fundamental level, like you could know everything about me and we could still cooperate. And there are, I think networks and relationships that people have where that's not the case, they're more fragile than people realize. And if we enter a period of increased turbulence, economic, et cetera, those are not the kind of people that you can count on. The kind of people that if they really knew who you were, that they would recoil in disgust and not want to cooperate with you or trust you, And so, yeah, I think there's something to kind of a filter that we're passing through where people have to make a decision. Do you want to commit to trying to see reality as it is, truth as it is, and speak that truth as you see it in order to network with and find other people that do the same and can respect the same? Or do you want to tether yourself to a system that's collapsing into incompetence? Wherever you look. And, the reason is why. So it's a late stage of bureaucracy where, the perception has dominated what's important to people. And the fact that that perception no longer aligns with reality and the difference between the two is only growing is maybe a source of mild frustration, but not something anybody feels like can ever be conquered. Like once they're not going to fight it because that would cost them status. They're dependent on this path. And I mean, that path, use a guy's paradigm, Chris Langan, who I don't think he lives too far from here, actually. The way he describes it is, the path of two singularities. You have the human singularity and the technological singularity. And that path of trying to deny reality as it is or think that perception can be elevated to be more important, it leads to that technological singularity. That's why there's this focus on artificial intelligence and artificial superintelligence, artificial general intelligence, that we can maybe transfer consciousness from flesh to machine, and that will solve all of these problems because then you won't have these natural constraints like conscience getting in the way of this widening gap between perceptions and reality. You could just make perception reality in the digital sphere, right? But where that really goes, that's more efficient self-deception. Where that goes is that just destroys humanity and replaces it with something not real, not aligned with our interests, not us, not animated by a soul, that, divine spark, whatever, that gives us that conscience, whatever it is, where like everybody knows what conscience is, they experience it, except, for the subset of the population that doesn't, psychopaths. And that's a problem in its own right. But, that's how I see it. We got these two paths, and, people can choose to try and see reality as, do what we do, and that's how we found each other. That's why we're friends. And then you get friends like that, people that you can probably genuinely count on, or you can try and count on the system, and specifically a system that is bureaucratic and focused on perception over reality.
Grant, we could do this for the next 3 hours. We're kind of getting ready to run out of time. So I want to ask you one final question on this topic. For those who are listening who, this is resonating, but they're still in hiding, like, what would you say to encourage them to to break loose, to let go of this obsession with status and be willing to take that first baby step toward doing what they know is right and stepping out of the pattern of trying to self-delude?
So I can't give blanket advice because it's very context dependent. Some people are not, they're in a precarious position, right? So like they have families that are a certain size, they need resources in order to just survive. And so a dramatic loss of status or getting canceled could adversely impact their ability to survive. But even in those situations, in those contexts, we're not going to survive in the long run unless people start speaking the truth as they see it and facing the consequences of that. The consequences might be painful, and maybe there's things that you need to do to get in order to prepare for that before you start being as vocal. But it's something that you have to do eventually, or we're not going to survive in the long run. And if we do survive in the long run, it's going to be not because of anything you did. It's going to be in spite of you. It's going to be in spite of people like you that have made the decision to continue denying what they know to be true, not speaking the truth as they see it. Maybe some of us can succeed and find a way ahead without everyone being on board. But it's like, do you want to be on board or not? Do you want to be part of the problem, or do you want to be part of the solution? And if you want to be part of the solution, you have to take risk. You have to assume that risk.
Grant, I knew this was going to be a great conversation. As usual, you challenged me, you made me think a lot. Remind our listeners where they can find your work and connect with you.
So I have a couple blogs. One of them is RadicalAmerican.substack.com. On Radical American, it's politically oriented. I have another one, h2fman.substack.com. That's more physical therapy, human performance oriented, although it touches on philosophy too. And then I'm on X at Liberty Superman. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Good deal. Well, you know where to find him. Go connect with him. Dr. Grant Smith, a good friend, and I'm glad this is just one of many conversations that we get to have because I'm fortunate to be in your orbit. Grant and I are coming to you from the Herzog Foundation studios in Smithville, Missouri. To learn more about the amazing work the Herzog Foundation does to catalyze Christian education nationwide, go to herzogfoundation.com. To connect with me and learn more about my work, head on over to chasespears.com. Remember, in this podcast, we share the stories and principles of courage with you, but it's up to you to put it into practice. It's up to you to find your spine. So get to it. I'm Chase Spears. Thanks for listening.
Remember to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode, and we'll see you next time on Finding Your Spine.